Hey everyone, I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this is Wide Ruled. Today I'm going to present to you a pretty much unedited conversation between myself and Cornell Ellis of BLOC, which is Brothers Liberating Our Communities, a really cool organization that he founded here in Kansas City. So, without further ado, here is our conversation. One thing to note, this conversation does contain some strong language.
Okay.
Would you introduce yourself?
My name is Cornell Ellis. I'm the executive director, co-founder of Brothers Liberating Our Communities, BLOC for short.
Awesome. So I've been a fan of BLOC for a while. I think we connected on Facebook a couple of years back
Yeah,
or something.
yeah,
And I think it's cool. I know that, like, in my memory, thinking about the schools I was in, the educational experiences I had, and the fact that I had almost all white educators in buildings where the student body was definitely not all white students, and just feeling sad about that, like feeling that was a loss for me personally, but certainly for also my peers of color. Um, so I'm curious, like, how did you get into education? And will you kind of tell us the story of BLOC?
yeah, sure, absolutely. Education has always kind of been a part of my life, right? So my mother is an educator. She's been a teacher in the Kansas City Public Schools for probably 30 years now. Even longer, I guess now I'm 30. So yeah, longer than that. Um, and she would come home every night kind of exhausted and have all
Mm.
these crazy stories and really kind of exemplify what it meant to be um, that educator, right? Like the educator that really cares for kids, the educator that goes the extra mile, the educator that wears, her students' situations on her shoulders and sleeves and brings them home. And I was on the other side of the fence, right? I was the educator's kid. I was the kid that heard all these stories secondhand, or I was the kid that kind of experienced the backlash or the emotional fallout
Mm.
from being an educator, right? um, when I went to high school, I went to Rockhurst High School here in town,
Mm.
and for senior year, you have a senior service project, and you're supposed to go and spend the first half of your senior semester doing some type of community service instead of going to school, right? You go to your community service site every day. And that was really my first experience with teaching. I went to Genesis School over here on, so it was like Prospect and like 42nd Street, at the Thornberry Boys and Girls Club unit. And I was a teacher's assistant at 17. I worked in a classroom. I think it was like third or fifth graders. I can't really remember now. But I sat with her every day and helped make lesson plans and help make copies and grade papers and made connections with kids. So much to the point where there's a kid I still keep in touch with from that classroom still to this day.
Oh,
It's
that's
been
awesome.
almost 20 years, and we still keep in touch with each other. But that was kind of my first, like touches with like knowing that I want to be involved with the next generation. I think
Yeah.
just as like a spiritual person and just as like a person that, walks the planet, I know that I won't be here for very long in the grand scheme of things. And to focus on the things that matter to me right now seems so trivial compared to the things that I should be focusing on that will happen after I'm gone.
Damn, that went deep, man. You went like straight to it.
We work to plant these seeds for trees that we'll never enjoy the shade of, right? It's all
Mm.
about the shade for the next generation, the movement and the steps that we take. Each generation fighting for their own piece of peace. And so teaching has always kind of been my, it's my everlasting goal. It's the
Mm.
reason why I exist, right? To leave a mark on the world after I'm gone, because I won't be here very long. And
Dang.
so when I played football at college, I was always kind of that guy on the team, right? Like the rah rah, like scream your head off, right? Like team captain, like this and that. And so that it was that really like personality trait that I really took with me once I graduated with a couple degrees in history to the school building, into the classroom. It was a phrase that I took from college called "enthusiasm is free," and it's a longer story, a longer traumatic story, but I get it from a coach that I had on a team that, you know, just drilled that into us day after day after day after day.
Enthusiasm is free. Enthusiasm is free.
Yeah, enthusiasm doesn't cost a dime, right? Like, you can get up and you can get after it, and you can carpe diem, right? Every single day. And I took that same type of enthusiasm to the classroom, to kids, and really like took my classroom and made it into this learning space that was explosive and that was, you know, it's palatable, right, for my administrators and for parents that came and watched, and for other teachers, right? And I think that, you know, becoming a leader within my school building kind of led me to start thinking about, like, what do Black teachers need? You know, what do my colleagues, you know, look to me for? What do I look to them for? You know, and so I started by founding or helping found this conference called Amplify. Amplify is a Teachers of Color conference funded by the Kauffman Foundation. We're in year 5 of Amplify, actually. Every year it's just gotten bigger and bad, or not bigger, but badder, right? Like the first year, we only sell 300 tickets. The first year, it took like 2 weeks to sell out. The second year, it sold out in about a week. The third year, it sold out in about 2 days. And then last year, it sold out in like 90 minutes. It was kind of unbelievable.
Wow.
The amount of like growth and exponential like buzz that Amplify has created, because we created this space, right, where Black teachers and brown teachers, like no white people allowed, right? It's Black and brown teachers, teachers of color getting together and sitting around a table and having real conversations, solving real issues, having real development. And it's come to be like this, like, family reunion kind of, you know.
That's awesome. And it's got, and there's like teachers from all over the country at that, right?
Well, we bring in speakers from all across the country, but our attendance is Kansas City teachers, right?
Cool.
So we have breakout sessions and keynote speakers of some national people. Jacqueline Woodson, Chris Hemden comes every year. Gloria Ladson Billings came last year. Some really heavy hitting people in education have been on that stage with us. But the people that we keep the participant tickets for are all local. We want to be able to serve our Kansas City teachers. And so through the
Are there white
network,
teachers that get butthurt about not being able to come?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to have that conversation all the time. Yeah, absolutely. Why? That's what whiteness does. Whiteness centers itself, and then it's fragile, right? And then it's fragile when it gets attacked or punctured, right? Seemingly. So after Amplify, through that network, we started working on Black men specifically, right? So I went to Philadelphia and met this guy named Sharif El-Mekki, who is a rock star on the East Coast, started an organization called the Center for Black Teacher Development. And back then they were doing the Black Teacher National Conference, Black Male Teacher National Conference. And me and 5 guys here from Kansas City went into a room in Philadelphia at a hotel conference center, and it was with 1,000 Black male educators from across the country in one room. And it was so powerful that we knew we had to bring it back to Kansas City, and found BLOC. So myself, Spencer Harwick, Gaston Woodland, Vincent Gunnels, Jeff Schaefer, and Bakari Uku were the original founders of the organization. And then I took on the executive director helm a year and a half ago, and we got our 501c3 last year.
Congrats.
So yeah, we're doing some really great work. We've been working, like I said, since 2016, but you know, we just got our paperwork and all that stuff this year, and trying to get some money behind us now. Yeah. You know how that is.
All right, listeners, does anyone want to donate? Actually, for real though, like if someone wants to support, like I know you got a website up, like there's a button for them to support if they want, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's always tax write-off and deductible for you to come and support Black male educators. Through our programs, it costs about $15,000 to $20,000 a year to sustain a Black male educator, retain him in education. We've retained 100% of BLOC members over the last 4 years. We've been in programmatic use. So our program works. We have the data to prove it. We just want to be able to serve as many guys as we can, you know? And so your support directly helps retain Black male educators, which directly supports the student's achievement, right? The data shows that all students perform better when they have Black male educators, right? Nathaniel, I'm sorry to tell you, but your educational experience could have been better if you
For
would have
real.
had.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question. I mean, like it's the one, like the two times that I had Black teachers, once in middle school and once in college, like two of my favorite teachers, no question.
Mm-hmm.
But dive into that more, what you're saying, like that data, like why does it matter to have Black teachers and specifically Black male teachers in the classroom at all levels?
Well, our mother, or our academic mother, Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, coined it culturally relevant pedagogy back in the 80s, right? With this idea where students and teachers that have cultural and ethnic and experiential and linguistic similarities to their students or similarities to their teachers have higher achievement, right? So if I come from the same neighborhoods as you, if I speak the same languages as you, if I have the same experiences as you, we're likely to connect on a deeper level. We're likely to be able to learn in the same ways and using the same languages, breaking down those barriers and then leading to that increased achievement. When it comes to white kids or kids that are different from you or different from that cultural perspective that you come from, I'll give it a personal example. Right now, I tutor for a pretty well-to-do family here in Kansas City. And they're white, of course, and I didn't really know how well-to-do they were until, you know, I started talking to some of my friends about the work that we were doing together. But I'm the only Black male educator that this young man has seen in his educational experience. And he goes to a school, and last year during the pandemic, you know, that's how we met. I was helping him kind of get through at-home classes, and I would sit through his history classes and like throw fits in the background about what type of curriculum was being taught or what stories you're being told, what narratives were being centered. And we'd have to like get out of his class and like do another one. I was like, give him
Do a little
another
unlearning,
lesson.
relearning.
Yeah. Yeah. And like this
Good work
idea
right
for
there.
him, not only is he getting that content that he never would have gotten, right? And as growing up as now a change maker, a white male in this world that's going to be a change maker in this world, to have those lessons, to have those bits of content in the back of his head, right? That you tell them stories and he's even pissed off, right? Like white people get pissed off when they hear about these things. Like, why the fuck would nobody tell me that, right? Excuse my language, but like,
no, you're good. Yeah.
That's unbelievable that that happened, and I've never been told that, right? And we should be pissed. Like all of us should be pissed. It's like not only does he get that content, but he also gets the idea that people of color or people that don't look like him can have a sense of authority over him, right? And I think that that is a double-edged sword there that is extremely impactful for people that hold privilege in this world, to be able to know someone personally that they have to answer to, right? That society has secondly told them is like beneath them, right?
Right. It's like that double-edged sword is slicing the myth of the racial hierarchy. Like it's actively disrupting that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean double edged in a pot, like it's cutting in both ways, right? Like not double edged as if like it has any negative effects as that idiom is usually used. No, like this, I mean, like this is a sword that has multiple edges that is cutting, right? Like and performing multiple purposes, right? Like I said, this kid's getting the content that he's missed, And he's getting
Right.
this ideological perspective that, right, the race stereotypes and myths do, right, or can have counterexamples, right, that then shapes his worldview, right? It widens his worldview.
Yeah. I love that. Like that gets like I think especially as so much of like the storytelling that I've done and like what excites me is what you're talking about. The fact that like I reminisce on my education, my understanding of history, my belief in the myth of American meritocracy. Um, uh, like I reminisce on that and I hate it, and it's why I read. It's why I read so many books now. It's why I like try to do the storytelling and work I do, because I don't want other people to grow up with the facade that is so often taught in history classes. It's
Mm-hmm.
represented in history books. Um,
Yeah, I
because
was listening to Dr. LeGarrette King recently, and he calls it nostalgia.
tell me about that.
It's not history, right? We like this narrative that feels good, right? We like selective memories. We like telling stories that uplift. And Dr. Chris Emden talks about the Oreo in several different ways as a metaphor, but one of the ways he uses like is the brown cookies, or the cookies on the outside of the Oreo, the structure that like holds up white supremacy, the whiteness, the creme on the inside, right? And these structures, right, like nostalgia or like fake history or whitewash history, right? Or what we're seeing right now is these like anti-CRT, like legislation, like actual policy.
Yeah.
These are the things that create physical structures to uphold white dominant culture. And if we're not critical and analytical of those things, they will continue to perpetuate themselves generation after generation, right? Like,
Right.
as much as it's like, I guess maybe we can talk about this now or another time, right? Like, people talk about Black people being racist, right? Like, I'm not racist. I'm prejudiced, right? Like, I look at white babies a lot, and I'm just like questioning. Like, my partner is white, and we have mixed children, right? So I know, I know these children are growing up having the right conversations, right? I sometimes you look at white
Mm,
families and you don't know if that's the case.
yeah.
Like I know there are some white, like you go to Applebee's as a big Black dude, babies will stare at you. Like, some white babies you can tell have never seen a Black person before.
Mm,
And
yeah.
it's like kind of crazy when it happens. And people around you will tell you that you're tripping. When you look like me, it happens a lot. Like, you can
Mm,
tell that this blonde hair, blue eyed baby has never seen a person that looks like you before. And that's this question runs through your head of like, what actually is going on? What conversations are happening at this house, right? Like, even teachers, right? Like, these white women teachers that are so like justice warriors, they go marry themselves a white man because their father and uncles and cousins wouldn't be able to stand any other way. And how justice oriented are you? Like, how much are you pushing? What type of children are you raising?
mm,
Right. And I think that unfortunately, we continue to perpetuate over and over and over again. We're raising children that are being taught the same whitewashed lies. It's
yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah. I think so. I don't have any kids. And I think like there's I would be so afraid. Like if I have kids as a white person, like I would be so afraid of how to shield them from that reproduction of the stereotypes and the racism that lives inside of me that I learned growing up, which I'm continually trying to deconstruct. And I believe for the rest of my life, I must like fight against it, because it's like I think of it, it's like the default setting. And
Yeah, yeah.
unless and we're so like surrounded by it that unless I actively continuously fight against it, like I'm gonna reset to default settings, and
Yeah,
I don't
it's
want
like a
that.
current. I
Yeah.
describe racism often. I do it. I like to make when my public speaking, I make extended metaphors to movies and equate popular Disney movies to inequitable practices in schools. It's kind of fun. But I do Moana, and when I talk about Moana, I talk about the ocean and the currents of the ocean kind of being like racism, right?
Mm.
Where racism is like, oh, we're like surrounded by it. It's all around it. It's the structure of white dominant culture that we built ourselves around. And if we don't actively acknowledge and be critical of it, like you said, it's like we're in a lazy river, right? And we'll just kind of go with the current, and we'll
Yeah.
just kind of continue to be flippant and buoyant and non-critical agents of our society. We have to, like, I heard another scholar describe it as like walking up an escalator, right? Like if you stop moving, then you're gonna go with the escalator, right? Like you have
Yeah.
to actively like walk down. Like I want to encourage you, man. Don't be and all white parents out there that are listening to this, don't be afraid to raise white children. I'm a cynical and 31-year-old Black man. I shouldn't be very happy with the state of our country, so don't listen to me. What you should be doing is exactly what you just said, Nathaniel. You don't have to shield your children from it. You have to show your children from it, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to be that constant everyday example, right? Like I told you earlier about the example of my son. My son heard me say that, and his mother is white. Yeah, we're going to talk about race in this house all the time. We're going to talk about the things that we see in the media that make me uncomfortable. We're going to talk about the things that we see in the media that don't represent us well, or that don't make us feel good. Like those are going to be conversations that happen in this house. If it's not politically correct to talk about race in your house, then like that's not helping your children be more critical, right? Like
Yeah.
we can't shield them from it. We have to show them from it.
One of the things that when I talk to other white people, you talk about public speaking. When I do public speaking around the history of segregation and talking about the history of racism, white people always ask about language. Like, well, what words should I use? Like, how do I refer to a Black person? And which always befuddles me a little bit, because it's like I don't feel like you're focusing on the right thing. But what I sympathize with, what I understand where that's coming from, is that for so many white people, we've avoided those conversations about race for so long that it sounds, you don't know how to say it. It's like a muscle you haven't used. It's like you've intentionally avoided it. Culture has taught you to avoid it. Maybe your family taught you to avoid it. So it's like you have to exercise.
It's like
the words,
muscular
like
dystrophy.
yeah, like, okay, you can say it with me. Black, you can do it. Black.
And they need that. You're absolutely right. Yes, they need that.
Yeah. That was a good laugh. I forgot where we were going with that now. But I just but I mean, I guess I see it in myself. Like I recognize there were times when like yeah, it's weird. Like you just gotta. It's a part of white supremacy. It's a part of that like myth of thinking that like I don't have race, like or myth of thinking I'm somehow outside of or separated from it. That like we
I'm
gotta just
colorblind.
exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like muscular dystrophy. Like literally you're like veal, right? Like you've never used these race talking muscles, like difficult conversations. I think that's why that book became so popular, because people were just looking for the framework. Another tenet of white dominant culture that I think white people fall into, all people fall into, is just like checklist of work of like, what do I do? Like, what do I do? Like, what do I do though? Like, okay, you're telling me what to think. You're telling me what to say. Like, are you telling me like what to, like, well, what do I do tomorrow? Right. Like, and they get caught up in, especially teachers too, right? Like when we talk about teaching with culturally relevant instruction, with culturally relevant and rigorous curriculum, some of these more recent tactics as we come back from COVID are kind of like around like learning accelerator techniques and affirmative or asset-based language, right? Like and how are we going to get kids back used to school, and how does school look different, right? But it's definitely, teachers are always kind of asking that question of like, well, do you have like a list of things that I can like check off to make sure that I'm being like anti-racist and racially relevant? And like not really. It's actually like more about like constantly, like we were saying, constantly thinking about your thoughts, being metacognitive about I always tell people like, don't let your first thought be your last thought, right? My one of my degrees in ancient world history, right? And so like there's this lesson, right, where you learn that when human beings moved from being quadrupedal, like on four legs, to like bipedal, because they're on like the East African plains, because we now can identify people from 40, 50 meters away, and we can kind of see whether they're different from us, or whether they look like us, or they wear the same garb or the same shield, and we can assess them pretty quickly. And that's automatically where our prejudice comes from. All beings are prejudiced because it's a human nature to assess people, whether or not they're from our tribe or not, whether they're like us or not, whether or not there's danger, or whether or not we're safe. The key to this anti-racist work is to not let your first thought be your last thought, right? So I may see a group of young men, and this is fucked up because as a Black man, this happens to me. I walk into the store and I see men that look like me, and I go, oh, like maybe I should like check my wallet and like make sure I have my car keys, and like, dude, you also have dreadlocks, and you also are wearing jean shorts. Like, you also wearing those shoes. Like, that's how ingrained this stuff can be, even for people of color, right? Or for people, like we said, we're steeped in this race, right? But the key is like not to let my first thought be my last one, right? So it's like, why am I feeling like this hesitation? Why am I feeling threatened? Like, what about that person is making me feel that way? Where's the root cause of this lesson coming from that's popping back up? Why am I in flight mode right now? And for people to kind of operate from that second level and third level of thoughts, as opposed to this first level of like just reactionary human feeling and human prejudge, right? Human prejudice, the better off we'll all be, right? If we can all just, ask ourselves, why am I feeling like this? There's actually nothing that different about this person. Why don't I smile and say hello and then see how they react, right? Like, why don't we all just operate from that level of consciousness, which I think we're getting to.
Yeah. I think that takes so much. Like, I think for me, going back to like flexing a muscle, or like practicing, having critical conversations, thinking more, reflecting more on how I exist as a person with race. There's a stamina that I think that especially white people have to build, that it seems like from what I've heard, and you can tell me if this has been your experience, where like people of color don't have to have that same stamina built, because it's they're constantly, like, white people are pushing it on them all the time anyway. Like, you're living in a racist society.
Yeah, I've been Black my whole life, bro.
Right. White people just started being white.
Right, exactly.
In their own eyes. So that when you start having those conversations, you have to build a stamina, so that when I find myself, I should stop saying you, when I find myself wrong, or when someone criticizes me, I have to build up stamina to be able to, like you said, sit with that emotion, like receive the criticism, or receive the like, or the meta, even like if it's just going on inside my head, like not jump to like a self-pitying place of like defeat or defensiveness, but instead gotta like work on it, move forward. Yeah, I'm just repeating the same stuff you're saying differently.
No, I think it's important that people hear it in different languages too, right? Because sometimes people, I think I have a lot of conversations with random white people about like, keep having conversations with other white people, because like when I bring it up, I'm just mad, right? Like, I'm just like, nobody's listening to me at that point. Like, by the time y'all got me to a point where I have to bring up race, like I'm already like in a heightened state of emotion, where most likely my melanin has had me written off as valid in this situation.
Which is too bad.
So
Yeah.
right, of course, right? Like a white man gets angry and he's passionate, right? Like he's really great at his work, right? But a black man gets angry and he's like an angry black man. He's like dangerous, right? A white woman cries at work and she is passionate or hurt. And a black woman cries at work and she, again, is like angry or aggressive or overreacting, right? I just was listening to one of my colleagues the other day, Cecilia Besler Patton, and she was saying, black women have just started to be seen as women in our country, right? From like Susan B. Anthony is an American icon. She also asked Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth to step back from the suffrage movement because they knew that Black women would hold them back from getting the rights to vote, right?
Yeah.
Black Breastfeeding Week is still a thing that we celebrate because Black women were often raped and then bore the children of their slave masters and then raised the children of their slave masters to have those children sold off for profit, right? Like,
yeah.
We're talking about like a gruesome history, not to mention the foundings of gynecology, right?
Right.
Like there are so many stories and so many lessons that are not mainstream, right? And there's a concerted effort to keep them that way. This past Saturday, we held a march and a rally for teaching truth. And it was so important for all the teachers that we saw show up to be able to stand up for those stories. You know, that young man that I was talking about that I helped with his schooling, listened to an entire 90-minute lecture about Thomas Jefferson. And then the teacher gave a 2-minute afterthought to Sally Hemings and the life and the times and the relationships that she had with Thomas Jefferson, as if it was like an allegation and as if it wasn't a real person who had a full human experience with this revered character of a founding father, right? Like, we're not asking anybody to stop telling the story of Thomas Jefferson. We're actually asking you to tell it better, right?
Yeah.
Like, which is so like boggling. That's the irony of the whole thing, right?
Right.
I think I read yesterday that like the Texas Senate actually passed this this bill that like effectively bans. It was on the day of the Washington walk, the March on Washington, and it effectively banned having conversations about the "I Have a Dream" speech. Like,
it's baffling. Like, it's what?
yeah. Like, how?
I mean, that, like,
You
come on,
know?
I mean, even like on a, white people usually get behind, like, that side of MLK. Like, they don't get behind
Right.
like the whole person of MLK, but they get like bits and pieces that they like, because they can talk about color blindness with that one and say that,
They don't
it's
even
right.
they don't even get behind that whole speech.
Right.
They get behind 2 or 3 lines of that shit.
That's right. That's right. And then even those they twist, like, they twist that bit about like yeah.
They don't, and that was the other thing. I went through some professional development with Dr. LeGarrette King, like I was saying, from the University of Missouri.
Yeah.
And he has an 8-point framework for telling accurate Black history, under this premise that like Black people are not allowed to be fully human in history. We teach a triad of Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and Barack Obama, right? Like there's like these 3 series, like these 3 eras of Black people, right? Like told through those 3 archetypes, right? those three people only have one side, right? Those three people aren't even like told in their full humanity, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And then the other sides or the other pieces of the story, or the other people involved are just like flat out missing, you know? And so the full humanity of Black people, right? Like Black people are Black people not allowed to disagree? Are there's always two sides to, you know, they demonize Malcolm X, right? But and there's we talk about Booker T. Washington, no one talks about the other side of that story, right?
Right. Right.
No one talks about Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, right? Like
Yeah.
these are all so intricate, and what they do is that they offer a deeper insight into African Americans and into history that allows us to exist outside of these paradigms and these archetypes. And
When you talk
that's
about like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, like that's like such a fact. I feel like it helps break out like the monolithic view of Blackness.
right,
Like
exactly.
instead of it being like this is a Black person at this time in history. Instead, you get
Yes.
like, oh, look, ideas are always complex.
Yes.
And then like for a student, I would think that also then helps you to understand dissent, understand that
Right.
you too, the student, can
Disagree.
yeah.
Yes, I'm teaching African American history right now, and that
Yeah.
is the essence of this course, right? Like
Yeah.
we're gonna be working from a foundational text called Revolts Against Slavery. It's a pretty low lexile but highly complex text that goes through like the 10 major slave revolts in American history, and we'll kind of use the text as a jumping off point, right? Like I think there's two mistakes that often happen in African American history. Like one is that it's often told from like a victim's perspective, right?
Yeah.
Of like who's been traumatized the worst, or like I said, from that triad of like these are all the struggles that Black people had to overcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that my curriculum helps battle against that by teaching through this critical agency lens, right? Of like, I had so many, like when I first started teaching, I kind of taught social studies, like I had so many Black kids ask me, like, how come slaves never fought back? Like literally, like how come like how come the niggas never stood up? Like I wouldn't be no slave. If it was me, I'd never be no slave. Well, like guys, you're right. Like there are thousands of these slave uprisings that occurred that they intentionally don't tell you about, right? So like this idea of agency and resistance, and right, a lot of these slave uprisings were foiled by other Black people, which then gives again like this complexity aspect of, you know, let's talk more about our own communities and let's talk more about the effects of mental slavery as opposed to this physical bondage. And so we'll kind of use that to kind of fight back against that critical agency piece. And then the second issue with African American history is often, again, from this white gaze of like the firsts, right? Like first Black person to do this, like first Black person to do this, like first Black person to do this. And it implies, right? Of course, like some of us may call this like a cognitive jump, but it implies that Black people aren't important until they cross the color barrier.
Yeah.
Right? That Black people weren't doing stuff until they were discovered by white people, right?
Or that they were if a Black person is a first, that they were the first Black person who was able enough or smart enough, whatever, athletic enough, whatever
to accomplish
was.
it. Yeah,
right. As
exactly.
if there weren't other Black people that did have the same skills, whatever, but they just weren't allowed in, or, you know, whatever.
Right. Yep. And so hopefully, you know, like that's also part of BLOC's mission, right? So how can we create content that Black teachers want to teach? We talk about teacher retention. That's probably the second biggest issue, right? Is that like they are teaching shit curriculum that they're being held to for shit tests by shit instructional coaches on a shit rubric. And that stuff piles up year after year after year after year. without opportunities to become instructional coaches or principals to be able to change rubrics or to change curriculums, right? Like only pushed along in disciplinary roles and kept in menial positions in the overall system of education. So yeah, that's just like a small slice of kind of how BLOC tries to increase the number of Black teachers in schools, right? Especially Black men, right? Is through that curriculum piece.
Yeah, and when you say that, like that kind of hits me, like that hits me thinking about like being a Black man teaching curriculum that the curriculum itself dehumanizes you. Like I think of, I've always thought of like I don't know. I think I've been privileged that I've almost always worked in like nonprofit companies in my day job. So there's always been like some mission. So I'll think of like, oh man, if I had to work at like some insurance firm, like pushing insurance policies, that would be a soul sucking job.
Yes.
But what you're describing, like, no, that's a soul sucking job. Like if you're having to teach curriculum that dehumanizes you or that neglects your humanity, like,
right.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That hits me.
Yeah, imagine picking up a textbook and like reading a story that is not true.
Yeah.
Right. Or that is incomplete. One of my that Sharif, guy I was talking about, Sharif El-Mekki, from Philadelphia, he was in the neighborhood that was bombed by the city police and moved in 1973, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And like that is like a story that the Philadelphia police, like the city of Philadelphia, didn't apologize for until like recently, right? Like they didn't talk about, that they didn't publish, that they didn't put in textbooks, right? But that my friend and mentor lost family members in, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like this history and this, that terrorism that is swept under the rug, right? It creates like a sense of animosity that's just only like a contributing factor to a lot of issues that we see.
Man, that made me think of
like imagine how kids feel like getting that shit every day,
Yeah.
Like no wonder I don't want to go to school.
Right. It made me think of some other historical things that something else that like we talked about. I can't remember if listeners, I apologize if this is not in the episode. Look it up, Google it or something. We talked about Brown v. Board of Education and how for me growing up, that was all flowers and sunshine and like, yay, we did it, which was the problem of we being me, a white person, all white Kansans. No, but I think that the bigger issue, then we talked about how it was more complicated and that it actually hurt the Black community in many cases, in a lot of cases. But I think something that was news to me, and even like recently. So you talked about Black resistance that has been a constant thread in American history. And when we think about Brown v. Board, like there's Black people resisting centered in that story. And then when we think of like the Dred Scott decision, like something that was an awful decision, an awful blow to Black people in America, but there were also Black people resisting who were actively being activists in that case. And that actually, thinking about the Dred Scott decision in that light, that was this year. I was reading 400 Souls, edited by Keisha Blaine and Ibram Kendi, and so one of the authors talked about that, and it like, I guess just thinking about like the pieces of history that we miss. Like I've known about the Dred Scott decision and all these other like Supreme Court cases that were blows to justice or advances forward in justice, and I've known about them for years, but seldom thought about the real humans who were courageous to put it all on the line, to move things forward. risking literally life and limb
Really.
from
Yeah.
white supremacists, angry neighbors, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really it's really sobering to think about. Like I remember when John Lewis died, I think that was kind of one of the first times that I, like as an adult male who works in activism and justice, like really sat and watched and listened to some of his speeches and some of the film and some of, the horrors, just like the flat out horrors that like people went through. And just back this on Saturday, we were having the march.
Yeah.
Dr. Carmeletta Williams is the executive director of the Black Archive Center. And while we were having, planning for this event, she was extremely concerned, like vigilant about us having our conscious observers, our lawyer observers, right? Legal observers. Because, it's just very real. It's very real. People are still dying for their beliefs. Protests and marches, just like the ones that we were in, people drove by and flipped us off and sped past us. And, that same shit happened just a couple of years ago. People died, and so it is a real threat. And it's so, like I said, it's sobering to think about.
Yeah.
And I try to, honestly, Nathaniel, like I try my best to continue doing the work without thinking about it too much. Because if you think about it too much, you'll stop doing the work.
Because of the
danger.
hope. The danger.
You can't think about your life being in danger that much.
Yeah,
and it actually is. Like it actually is. There are, police actually do kill people that look like me when they pull me over.
Right.
People do actually get death threats that do the work that I do. I'm on a lot of these public appearances in the last couple of weeks. Been on the news a few times. I've been, my sister has gotten a death threat in her voicemail, because she does equity work around the city. This is not, this isn't a fake thing.
Right.
So I just, there's people. One of my good friends was showing me a graphic that racism and kind of like pulling people along on their journey is kind of like people in a pool. And it's like, there's like fives, and fives are like underwater, like suffocating, like, drowning. And then there's like fours who are like kind of swimming for the edge. Threes like kind of have their head above water. Twos like kind of have one leg out of the water, and like ones are like up on dry land. And each of them like have their hand back to the person behind them, like trying to bring them up, like trying to pull them out of the waters of racism, right? But like as a one, or as someone who's like standing on dry land, like the point of their analogy was that like I can't reach the people, the fives, right? Like I can only reach the twos, the people that are desperately climbing out of the water, right? And the twos can only reach the threes, the people who are just now getting their head above water. And the threes can only reach the fours, who are still just kind of thinking about getting air. And the fours can try to reach the fives, but if they're gonna be down there being stubborn.
So the five, so like one is someone who's sort of enlightened, who's fully awake to the reality of
or someone who's showing other people the way, right? Someone who's constantly, no one is enlightened, right? There are people that are working towards it, right? Constantly working towards it. I work with a principal at Brookside Charter School. I do some executive coaching over there. And she is a phenomenal example of a person who is a one, right? It was a person who spends her free time reading justice novels, who uses her social media account, her personal social media account, to reshare and follow and share justice accounts. She has a mixed race family. She is constantly leading her school towards like book studies and having these conversations with other family members, right? Like she's a great example of someone who's a one, but I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that analogy, right? Like I think as a person, like I can have a conversation with a five, you know, I can have a conversation with someone who doesn't want to hear that. I don't come across them very often. I'm in an echo chamber myself. I don't come across
Sure.
many people that really disagree with me. But I don't know. That's here nor there. I think the point was white people need to be having conversations with other white people.
Yeah.
And white people need to hear what you said, right? From people that look like them, people that come from situations like them, closely relevant, right?
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so a question that I have, this self-serving, whatever. It's so as a white, that was actually a really good segue. I had this burning question, and then you like segued into it perfectly. And then of course I ruined the segue by like over-explaining the segue. So as a historian, I'm really curious. So I'm a white guy, and I want to be in this justice work. I've for the past 8 years or so, in one way or the other, been involved in telling stories, trying to counteract the narrative, unlearn what I learned in history classes growing up, and contribute to the struggle for racial justice. I find myself really curious and wanting to find white men historically or presently to look up to, who are like to find like I want to find another white male who is engaged in this story of racial justice, so that I can see like how did they, you know, come out of their cave? Like how did they begin to unravel the mental gymnastics that us white males have to put ourselves in order to believe we're good people in a system that's built on our oppression. So I'm curious. What is my question?
Okay, because I don't know that many white
Yeah.
authors right now. I think.
Well, and then like every time, like I mean,
name.
you talked about like not knowing what a white
Kozar?
child is being taught, and I have this. I mean, I have prejudice against white male authors too. That I'm like, I don't know if I can trust this guy, because without knowing everything. And there's actually good examples. There's good reason for that. Like I remember. Are you a football? Well, yeah, you said you played football. You're a Chiefs fan. So I remember, unfortunately, back in February, when the game wasn't going so well, I just couldn't watch. It was too painful. So I flipped it off. And I was at the time reading a biography of crap. How do I blank on this guy's name? It was the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Gosh darn it, what's his name? I'm like looking at the books behind me because it's on a book
Sure, it's
spine
back there,
me.
right?
Yeah. So the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he, like, Southern Poverty Law Center has done all this great work against the KKK, raising awareness about like hate groups. They've had voter justice legislation they've supported. But I finished this book, and then I Googled the guy because the book came out like 10 years ago or something, and find out that he was fired, as he's this white man, from his organization for being a racist in the organization. And it was like just a jarring moment of like, gosh darn it, I just want a fucking white male who I could look up to for being like an awesome like racial justice hero. And they're just being white guys. Like they're just too white. So what was my question? I guess
Kozal comes to mind.
Who? Jonathan Kozal?
Yeah. Have you read Shame of the Nation?
No, I haven't.
I've skimmed it. He's an education writer, and he's been writing for shit. Looks like his bibliography goes back to the early 80s, late 70s. Wow. About alternative schools, writing to teachers about the inequities in education. And Shame of a Nation's subtitle is The Restoration of Apartheid. So he
Wow.
is a guy whose name rings throughout education as a white male
Yeah.
who consistently has been on the right side of history.
Do you think it's right for white men like me to look for other white men, men, like
Yeah,
mentors or like people to look up to, role models?
yeah,
That's the word I want.
yeah, yeah.
Or is that actually reproducing the problem? Like, is it better for me just to be like, oh man, I look up to Cornell, and like he's my role model. Um,
I think that's
or like
interesting.
Ibram Kendi, he's my role model.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really interesting, Nathaniel, because it kind of like you said, it can err on this side of like, I don't trust the validity of this argument unless I hear it from another white man's mouth,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the positive side to me is like we said before, right? Like I think that white people that hear it from other white people, even if it's rooted in that implicit bias of like I think it's only valid if I hear it from other white people, still is positive. It still has a net positive effect. And hopefully whomever you are looking up to will tell you to go talk to a Black person and respect them also, right?
Yeah.
That would be some advice that you would get and receive from this legitimate mentor. And if not, then I would question my mentor.
Yeah.
Like the first thing another white person should ask you always is like, have you talked to a Black person about this? Like their job is to recenter, is to help you decenter your whiteness, right? And so like if they're not helping you do that, right? If they are helping you perpetuate this, like, well, here's what I think, and here's what my perspective is, and here's the way I see it, right? Like, nah, fuck how you see it, right? The real question is like, how does the person of color see it? How does the person who you caused harm to see it? Have you sought that information out? Do you need help thinking about how to have that conversation? Maybe through my experiences with people of color, which are extensive because I'm a scholar in this subject, I may be able to give you a few pointers on how to have this conversation. But ultimately, it's going to be up to your white ass on dealing with the harm that you caused, right? And hopefully, that's the type of development and conversations that white mentors are having with each other. If I was a fly on the wall, that's what I would like to hear.
I love that. I think that's great. I think that's great because it's convicting too. Because I have a recent, in the past year memory of when another white person. I'm not a huge scholar. Like I've done some things, but another white person did come to me, and I super regret that wasn't my response. That I didn't have the response to say, hey, like you shouldn't be asking me this. I'm the wrong person to ask. Like you need to talk to the people of color in the community that you're talking about that was in question. So
because I think
said that.
that's one of the like in my years of education and working with people, that's what I've found to be the biggest difference between us and y'all is that we just like communication. We just communicate different, right? I think that oftentimes the way that white people communicate is a little bit more non-direct, indirect, right? And it's a little bit more it's a little bit less about seeking to understand, and it's a little bit more about expressing their own opinion or kind of where they're coming from. And I think that a lot of people of color or people from non-Western societies deal with conflict in a different manner, which leads to a lot of that original kind of tension, right? Where, like we said before, like emotions are oftentimes like misread in between communities or like mislabeled in between communities because communication just looks different, you know? So yeah, I think, right, like that mentor or, you know, this white person that we look up to, has got to be able to be the intermediary there, right? Of like, listen to what you're saying, right? Like, listen to the words you're using, listen to the ways that you approach the situation. Now let's think about a different way to approach the situation. Probably one that's going to make you uncomfortable, right? Like probably one that's going to push you out of your comfort zone. And that's okay, because if you're centering the person of color, then you should be uncomfortable. If you're comfortable all the time, you're not growing, right? It's like a hermit crab.
Yeah. Wait, the hermit crab? Because you're in your shell, you're all safe, right, protected.
And then once you get too big for it, don't you have to get out and go find another one? Isn't that a hermit crab?
Yeah, that sounds right. Go get a new home. Yeah. Well, Cornell, thanks so much for this. Has been really great. Like I'm humbled and yeah, I think this has been really, really awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate always having a conversation with people, and it's even better when it's filmed, because now I'll be able to be embarrassed for all time.
Nah. You talked, I got a good full circle. You started off kind of talking about legacy and how like you got into education because what I heard was you wanted to multiply that impact so that like you're not here on this earth forever, but you can impact others and then they carry on that torch. So, filming something is just another way to have a little bit of legacy. Hopefully lots of people here and listen are inspired by you and convicted by you. I
would hope so. Hopefully there's a Black male out there listening that's like, you know what? I'm going to go be a teacher now.
That's right.
Call me.
And yeah. If that's you should hit Cornell up. Let him know.
White person, maybe there's another person out there, maybe even a white person out there that's like, you know what? I should donate to the BLOC.
Where can people find the BLOC?
The BLOCKC.org. THEBLOCKC.org. Our YouTube channel is going to be launching soon. We're on all the social medias. I have a really great media team that's been capturing. He just called me yesterday. He was like, dude, like, how much of this stuff do you want uploaded? Like, we have a pretty like hefty archive of video from 4 or 5 years now of the work that we've been doing. And
it's awesome.
If you want to get involved, we always are looking for volunteers at our events. We're always looking for people to come be a part of the movement. So
white or black.
Yeah, don't matter. We'll find a space for you. So connect with me and we can have a conversation about where you fit in and what things are in your wheelhouse and how you can keep the block hot. That's what we like to say. We keep the block hot.
That's awesome. Cool. That's it. Well, thanks. Now this is like we're done, but I still feel like I have extra gratitude to express, but now actually, let me just stop the recording. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Wide Ruled. I'm your host, Nathaniel Bozarth. We've been with Cornell Ellis from BLOC, Brothers Liberating Our Communities. You can look them up. You can get involved at theblockkc.org. That's the BLOCKC.org. Thanks so much for listening to Wide Ruled. You can support the podcast on patreon.com/Wide Ruled Podcast. Theme music was produced and composed by Dominique Fields. Wide Ruled was started as a part of Brain Root Light and Sound. Cheers.